My goal in looking at national climate funds was to understand how developing countries mobilize finance to support climate action in their countries. And the reality is that many countries receive a very small fraction of international climate finance in the form of budgetary support. And most of the climate finance that goes into developing countries flows either through multilateral development banks or bilateral aid agencies. And so national climate funds in this regard have often been a platform that allows multiple funders to come together to support a nationally owned vehicle that is often explicitly tied to the implementation of a national climate change plan. We saw a wave of national climate funds being created in the early part of the 2010s and the late part of the decade prior to that. This very well mapped on to developing countries starting to formulate their national climate change plans. And so we have seen national climate funds being created as a financing arm of these climate change plans. But of course, the history of trust funds in particular goes far back to conservation trust funds in particular. And over time, we have also seen conservation trust funds themselves expand their scope and their mandate to also more explicitly include climate change into their programming. Now, we also have to remember that in the early part of the 2010s, we did not have the Green Climate Fund yet, and that was still being negotiated and designed. And so many of these national level funds were really the attention in terms of the finance bit. And so many countries created these funds as a way to attract international climate finance. One thing that really stands out across all of the funds in terms of a key function is the necessary in-house expertise, both in terms of fund management, in terms of having fund managers who have the background and the expertise in managing funds, as well as the expertise in climate change programming itself. Because at the end of the day, the value of a national climate fund really is in terms of its value addition that it adds to the wider landscape of other potential delivery channels. And so the more a national climate fund is able to show that it's able to manage money well and to spend them to achieve climate change objectives in a very clear manner, the better or more sound will its value proposition be. And so we've seen some of these things come across quite a large number of funds. Now, some funds are equipped with independent legal personality, whereas others are not. And there really is no right answer in terms of, should a national climate fund really be backed by an act of parliament, for example. It really comes down to what the objective behind the fund really is, and if a fund should be equipped with that legal personality for it to be able to have the financial instruments that it would then be able to use, unlike funds that would not necessarily have independent legal personality. So we saw a lot of ambition initially by a number of countries in creating these national climate funds. But what we also saw was that they were placed in ministries that simply were not equipped to manage these funding entities. And so that was the first order challenge that many countries really had to confront, was how do you make sure that people who have the expertise to manage funds are actually able to do so. Now, the second challenge is in terms of the National Climate Fund being able to articulate its value proposition in a very clear way, especially when a fund seeks international climate finance. Climate finance providers have a range of delivery channels as options, and therefore, if the value proposition of a national climate fund is not clear or compelling, it will become more challenging for a fund to raise finance. And so one particular challenge that national climate funds have confronted is in specifying and communicating and articulating what their unique value propositions really may be. So there are two major lessons that stand out when a country evaluates whether it needs a national climate fund or not. The first piece really is how exactly does the National Climate Fund fit within the larger architecture of climate finance within a country. Now, for some countries, certain sectoral ministries may have already made major strides in advancing climate change by incorporating climate considerations directly into their sectoral plans. And so if that is the situation, the design of a national climate fund does not really have to focus on the sectoral ministries and encouraging them to integrate climate change into their programming. The National Climate Fund could then be oriented towards other activities. And so what we saw in the early part of the decade was many funds were established primarily to encourage other ministries, other sectors to integrate climate action into their own plans. But as the needle has moved in many countries with sectoral ministries coming up with their own, the need for incentives and encouragement is a little bit different than what it was maybe 10 years ago. The other lesson is that having an independent legal entity can be a very important ring fencing device because governments often change, political priorities often change, and so therefore by having a national climate fund that is at an arm's length from the political cycles can ensure that climate change continues to receive dedicated attention through these particular vehicles that may be equipped with independent legal personality. And we've seen some of this play out when after governments change, they are not able to interfere in the governance of a particular fund because they have been awarded independent legal personality. One way in which these funds can be better utilized is by making sure that these funds have sound spending and allocation frameworks to make sure that they are able to work very closely with potential implementers of these projects and to make a case for how they are actually spending precious public climate finance in a very sound way. And oftentimes we have not seen this to be the case. And so one important thing that existing national climate funds could do is to have very strong results management frameworks to be able to show the impact that these particular funds are actually having. And it's important to scale these funds because most of these funds actually have been pretty small. There are some rare exceptions, but we have seen how by having these national climate funds, they're often able to reach places, especially in terms of climate resilience and adaptation, that they're able to reach communities and work with other NGOs and other implementing agencies that may be finding it a hard time to access resources from other channels. So there are many, potential climate finance providers and contributors, and one important challenge that many developing countries face is that climate finance is fragmented, that it's piecemeal and it's provided through many different channels. And so one important role that national climate funds can play is to bring them together so that there is a series of funders behind a common agenda, and therefore countries don't have to create parallel institutions or worry about working cross purposes, and they can really have a unified set of interested parties working to support a common purpose. Well, first of all, we have to remember that independent legal personality often requires an act of parliament, and that can be a very time-consuming process. And so if the objective is to be very fast and expedient, then not having a legal personality can be a good choice for that particular moment. But of course, if there is enough will to get this through Parliament, then it also comes with the legal protection that you would get in the form of independent legal personality. Now, having that kind of legal authority also enables a fund to be deploying a wider range of instruments than a fund that does not have similar status. Well, first of all, I think it's to properly articulate the value proposition of a national climate fund. Governments need a very sound understanding of what exactly are the barriers and what barriers stand in the way of enabling climate action in a country. And so I think with that, more of a diagnostic understanding of what exactly are the challenges that are impeding climate action in your country, then what exactly are the sets of incentives that need to be brought into being to make sure that those barriers can be tackled and removed. That understanding would be very important. And by having that understanding and designing a national climate fund to be able to remove those incentives, would be where we would see the most value. One of the most important decisions will be around hiring and making sure that the National Climate Fund is staffed with people who have the experience, both in fund management as well as in climate programming, so that the National Climate Fund has the human resources and the personal capacity that it really needs, and therefore to be in a position to actually implement and make sure that the fund is able to work in an efficient way. So sometimes countries have pollution taxes that enables them to raise money towards climate change goals. But what we also sometimes see is that if a fund is not designed properly, they will collect domestic resources but not actually spend them. And so making sure there's the right staffing, the right spending frameworks, and the right incentives in place to be able to actually spend the money is important.